next week. So we really appreciate you being here and sharing this space with us. Okay, so we're going to start off with a conversation between me, Wad, and Nameria, and we're going to talk about what it looks like to create boundaries with our parents as children of immigrants. And then we're going to invite a parent actually to be a part of the conversation around 8:15, 5:15 PST, to have a conversation about what it looks like to be a parent and how boundaries have shown up for them. And so at the end of that, we're going to have a sort of Q&A where y'all can input your questions and we can have a conversation together on what that looks like for you. And then you all can see that there's a chat function. So feel free to use that chat function if you have any questions, and please use this in real time. So we're going to be looking at the chat function while we're having our conversation, and depending on the space, we'll answer the questions or we will move them towards the end of the chat. So feel free to, put your comments, anything like that. We love the engagement. It's kind of hard to get a sense of what people feel like over Zoom. So as much as y'all can use that, please do. The hashtag for tonight's event is #AfricanFamilyTies. So feel free to use that on Twitter and Instagram. You can engage in that as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Nameria, for putting that in the chat. Okay, so just a couple things before we get started with the event. So the first thing I want to say is that we're not trained family psychologists, right? So we're really speaking from our own personal experiences as children of immigrants. And I want you all to take that with a grain of salt, right? Like, we're not perfect. We're processing things as they go along. A lot of us are new to this. And so I want you to take that, take our lessons, take our journeys with you. But if you're going to apply them to your real lives, please, if you need help, really engage with maybe a professional or talk to a trusted friend. The second thing I want to say is that the comments that we're making tonight is not indicative of African culture as a totality, right? We're talking from our specific narratives and backgrounds, and I don't want it to become reductionist where what we're saying is about, all of African culture, because every family has challenges when it comes to boundaries. It may look a little bit different given your specific immigrant background or African culture. And so before we get started, we're going to talk about our bios, because we want you all to get a sense of the lens that we're coming to this conversation with, so that you all can take this with a sort of understanding of what that looks like for us. And so before we get started on our bios, we wanted to know where everybody is coming from. So we want to know what your ethnic background is. So if you're from Africa, what country you're from. So put that in the chat, as well as maybe the state that you grew up in if you are from the US, and just the city you rep or where you're sort of zooming in from. So we're going to give a couple minutes to do that. So feel free to go into the chat. All right, Richmond, Wad, okay. So your country of origin, your ethnic background. Samia said, unfortunately, the US of A. I feel that. All right, Ethiopia, okay, yes. Awesome. Oh, we got some East Coast, New York.
I see Sierra Leone in the house. What up?
Hey, come on.
Hey, Ghana.
I'm seeing Somalia. Okay. Chicago. What's good?
I love it.
Nigeria's in the house.
Okay.
Welcome.
Puerto Rican. That's awesome.
Jamaica, the diaspora. We love to see it.
Yes.
Kenya. Okay, cool.
I love it. I love it.
Welcome. Welcome. Welcome.
All right. So as people
are being here.
Yeah, absolutely. So as people are starting to put their countries of origin and states that they rep, I wanted to start off with bios. So Wad and Nameria, please tell me just your specific, bio, where you're from, and then also give us some context on how you're entering this conversation around boundaries. So the lens that you look at boundaries, how you define them, all of that. So let's start with Wad. You're nodding and you're smiling.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wad, reigning from the lush land of Sudan. I got my master's in public administration from UNC, Chapel Hill, and I'm a certified conflict manager. But more importantly, I'm super passionate about love in all forms. And I value things like freedom, creativity, and community. I have traveled to about 30 plus countries. So if you're interested in knowing how to do that and for cheap, let me know. I'm more than happy to talk about it. The lens that I come to this conversation with is one as being a first-gen American. So I was born in Sudan, moved to the United States when I was about 5 years old. I am the oldest daughter and the only girl, which a lot of people says means I'm spoiled, but I don't really believe that. I speak Arabic and English, and I was raised with a Muslim background. So I was raised traditionally very Muslim. And so the way boundaries have shown up for me and my family has been sort of a lifelong journey, sort of creating them from when we were younger, trying to ensure that they didn't treat me different from my younger brothers. And so that journey has just sort of continued to evolve the older that I've gotten.
How would you define boundaries? Oh, actually, yeah.
Now,
let's hold up. Okay, let's hold up. That could be the next question. All right.
Can I come in? Can I come in?
Yeah, you can come in. Yeah. I was way ahead of myself.
Hey everyone, my name is Nameria Conteh. I am a second year doc student at the University of Missouri. I study youth engagement and how that affects community development, specifically minority youth engagement. So I'm coming to you all as a first generation queer immigrant from West Africa. I was born in Sierra Leone and grew up in Lusaka, Zambia. And then I moved to the US when I was about 9 or 10 and lived with my aunt who eventually adopted me. So I'm more of like the community child, you know what I'm saying? Just running around, everybody knew me. And yeah.
I love that. Thank you, Nameria.
And what about you, Dise? Let's hear your bio.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gadise. I also go by Dise. My parents are from Ethiopia, and they are Oromo. And they came to the States in the 80s. I think like a lot of people, I feel like there's a lot of influx of immigrants in the 80s. And I was born shortly after, about 2 years after my mom came here in the 90s. And so in a lot of ways, my mom, as she was learning the US and the specific culture here, I was sort of learning the world. So I kind of grew up with her in some ways. And she's a single parent of 6 kids. And I'm the second oldest daughter. So similar to Wad, a lot of the responsibility was sort of on me. I kind of felt like I was a little bit of the co-parent, right? Because I'm taking care of my younger siblings, babysitting, also translating. I feel like a lot of people can relate to that. Filling out paperwork. So I knew how to navigate systems at a very early age, just supporting my mom. My mom is probably the hardest worker I've ever known in my entire life. And she's the type of person in her family where everybody looks to her for help. And so when my family, she was the first in her family to come to the US. So when the rest of my family started coming, she was really supporting them. So I saw how she sort of served her family. And that's sort of how I'm very similar to her in that way. And I'm in my family, I'm the one that everybody comes to, like, to support and just work through things. So that sort of, you'll see when we talk about boundaries, how that comes into play. And I grew up in a very white town in San Diego. And so how I talked about, or how I learned my African and Black identity was very colored by how racist my town was. And I felt like that kind of there were really interesting conversations with my mom about race and racism as somebody who grew up in Ethiopia versus, me, where I grew up and, became an adult through the US. And so I'm a PhD student at UCLA. I'm coming up on my 4th year, which is wild. I feel like time has passed. And I am studying college mental health and burnout. So this is really interesting to me because I love talking about healthy relationships, especially in the college setting. So I'm excited to talk about, families. So let's move on to the first question. How do you all define boundaries? What does that look like for you, especially within the African family?
I'm going to defer to Nameria to start this off because I think she has an amazing,
Yeah.
first perspective.
Okay, so my first interaction with boundaries was, it was rather restrictive, right? Like I grew up having a certain cultural expectation of me that I neither concurred to nor understood. I just knew that I just couldn't do certain things because I was African. And so as I got exposed to different levels of education, different people, different cultures, I started to kind of push a little bit and question, well, what if this identity that you guys have created for me conflicts with my own identity, right? Like, what if I think she's pretty and want to pursue her? What does that look like in the African community? And so that was hard because I was often met with little answers and much redirection to just follow the path, follow tradition, almost as if I was tasked to preserve a culture that I didn't understand, you know? And so, yeah, that was my first introduction to boundaries. Right now, boundaries look like I wouldn't say I have the strongest sense of self, but I have an okay, sense of self. And to me, it's important to have that balance where not only honoring my traditions and culture, but also making sure I'm honoring myself, right? Like, if I don't want to wear a dress, I'm not wearing a dress. I'm gonna date who I want to date, and I'm gonna show up with her. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that's how boundaries have been shaping in my life as of late. What?
I think for me, I actually, in you saying that, Nameria, I thought about the first boundary I created, and it's something I mentioned very quickly in my bio, which is ensuring that my parents did not treat me differently from my brothers. And that was like a very clear boundary that I remember setting at a very young age, just based off of the treatment of women versus men that I saw in like every time we visited Sudan, or saw like within my friends' family dynamics who are also Sudanese. And I was like, I can't, no, I want to play outside too. And I don't want to have to do dinner. Like, I don't want to have to cook the dinner right now. I want to be able to play outside. So those were sort of my first introduction to boundaries as it related to my family. But when I think about boundaries now, I think about the idea that we create the reality that we live in. And I think about how boundaries are what you allow and don't allow people to do within the reality that you live in. So it's like, I choose for this to be my world, or I choose for this to be my reality. And if these are the actions that you're portraying, then I no longer want you to be a part of that reality. Or while you're here with me in this present moment, then those actions are not welcome in this space. And I need you to respect that. And then taking action based off of what that action is. Because, sometimes people will come into this space and be like, yeah, we can respect that, and then not. And then at that point, the responsibility really lies with you to take action on your part as to how you handle that situation. So boundaries are not just, like a hot topic word that are being used, or that's being used widely and regularly. I think that boundaries are really more so of an action word. And they're not something that just happened currently and now in the present. It's something that happens and then is tested and tested and tested. And something I've talked about openly also is that it's okay for those boundaries to change, because as you grow and as you evolve, your ideas of how the world works and how you work and how you understand yourself also change. And so it's okay for them to also evolve in that way as well. So that's sort of been my experience with boundaries. Gadise, what about you?
I love that. I feel like I would describe boundaries as verbal and nonverbal guidelines on what you think is okay and not okay. And I say nonverbal because I think we always know what our boundaries are, right? when you're younger, like for example, my mom is a devout Christian. So we went to church every Sunday. And when I would go to church, I would avoid certain old people because there's this one old lady that had a mustache, and we would call her Porcupine Lady because she would come and like kiss us on the cheek. And I would be like, oh no. And that is sort of like I would say an example of a nonverbal boundary, right? Like there was, I would tighten up, I would avoid her. We know how we want to be treated. The issue is like, how do we communicate that? And so when I was younger, especially seeing my mom as somebody who often served other people, regardless of, whether or not she was comfortable with it, she was sort of a sacrifice to make sure that everybody else was good. And she really didn't prioritize herself. And so that's how I learned how I connected with others, were through service. And so that would be with my family, with my friends. And then like in school, like I feel like I wouldn't want to communicate when I felt uncomfortable because I didn't want to be a burden to anybody else or like inconvenience anybody else. So a lot of my boundaries are very silent, even though I would feel it inside, like, oh, I'm not comfortable with this, or, I don't want to be here right now. But it's just something that I did. I think that that's also a gender thing too, because I feel like men are able to have this space to sort of communicate what they want and they don't want to do. And I think in a lot of times women they're communicated by the environment and people around them that you have to be uncomfortable and in order to like secure everybody else's comfortability. And it wasn't until recently, like I'm 30 now, I've started to have this conversation with my parents in the last couple of years. And I moved out of the house at 18. And so it's taken this long for me to sort of vocalize what I want. And I think the hardest part comes through the communication of boundaries. And for me, healthy boundaries is like having awareness of what causes me like peace, joy, health, and prioritizing that in the way that I communicate it. And it's not, I used to communicate stuff in a very passive aggressive way because I didn't like conflict. And for me, healthy boundaries is being able to do that in a direct way. And I think it becomes difficult because I don't know if y'all's family does this, but when I want to, for example, like not like hang out with my friends or something, right? Or I won't call home for maybe like, a couple days, or mom will call me like, do you not love us? And so like my boundaries is a direct conflict to whether or not I love them as people. And so I think it's really hard when you have, in African cultures, at least my culture, is very communal and very codependent. Like my survival is your survival. So then when you create a sort of boundary, that's communicating to you that I don't love you or I don't care about you, which is not the case, right? I care about myself, but I also care about you. So I've been learning on how to like vocalize my care and love for my family at the same time, like to reassure them as I'm creating these boundaries. But it's tough. It's tough.
Gadise, something that you said really resonated with me, because when I think about like Sudanese culture, some of the number one thing everyone says about Sudanese people is like, they're so hospitable and they're willing to give you the shirt off their back, which to me is essentially like they're willing to fill your cup even if it means emptying theirs. And I do not ascribe to that. And I had to learn that. Through time and through age, because I remember, the easiest boundary to set is with strangers. You literally have nothing to lose. Like there is literally nothing to lose. And so when you're forced to bend backwards for strangers at such a young age, having that be the groundwork or the foundation for what boundaries are for you, they essentially become non-existent. Because if I can't break a boundary with a stranger who says they're, coming over, and I'm leaving the house, but I have a very distant associate who says, I'm in town, I'm going to come to your house. My whole plan has to change now. I have to welcome them. There's no way I can't allow them in this house. They've traveled from God knows where, and they deserve to stay here for weeks on end.
You're better than me, Wad. The Hilton always has rooms.
Yeah, that's you now, Nameria. Okay, think of the family that you were raised in. That was just such a norm. There's a person who we know through a friend of a friend of a friend who happens to be here. We were going to go out, but now everyone stay home because we have to welcome them. and now they're a part of this unit as well. And so when I saw that it was difficult for my parents to break boundaries with people who are essentially strangers, it became then difficult. That's what I learned. It's difficult to break boundaries or to build boundaries with people who are strangers. And then how much more difficult is it to build boundaries with people you love and care for and cherish and have actual lasting relationships with. So I think it becomes a more difficult journey based off of the culture that we hold and share and the values that our families share. But I think those values are held because of something Nameria, I think, had once said, which is about like maintaining the culture and about survival, especially in a completely different country. You know, it's like binding together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oof. I was thinking about also in boundaries today about how we respect other people's boundaries and how we learn that. And I think it's not only like how we set boundaries for ourselves, but how do we recognize boundaries in other people? And I say that because, you know, since I'm the second oldest and I've started, you know, realizing things about myself, and I've started to communicate that with my parents, you know, since I have younger siblings, how do I help them through that process too? Like, for example, so my mom will call me and tell me things about my siblings that she needs help with. And so what I started to do, because that is very stressful, especially when you're in a PhD program and you also have to do research and all this other stuff, how do I communicate those boundaries on behalf of my siblings? And so I would tell my mom, like, hey, I think you should ask my sister before you communicate with me about her story or her issue. Ask her for consent. Because, you know, your parents won't do that. They're just going to tell you what it is. You know what I mean? And I think the first time I started communicating with my parents about my boundaries, I was met with resistance, right? And what we were talking about, like, you don't love us, or why are you doing this? You're being selfish, you're being rude, you're being disrespectful, especially to elders. And so maybe I would want to ask you all this too. How, when you communicated those boundaries, how were they met by your family members, and how were you able to navigate that?
So I think the first time I communicated my boundaries, or what I thought were boundaries, set expectation, was when I didn't want to study political science anymore, because I didn't even know what political science was, right? Because every time someone asked me, what are you studying? I'm like, oh yeah, political science. And they're like, what is it? I'm like, hold on, let me Google, you know, because I don't know. And so I sat with my mom and I said, hey, I don't want to study this because I don't know what it is. And also, I want to date women and do what I want. And she said, excuse me? And we had a pretty long conversation. I think I was like, what, 23? We had a pretty long conversation, and it really just boiled down to, I really asked her, I said, if I accomplish all that you want of me in this life, and I still don't marry who you want, and I'm an artist or play the violin or something, does that mean you don't love me? And
what she said?
Girl, I don't know. I think she still loved me. No, she cried. Like, it was a hard conversation for her to have, because she was like, you know, my expectations of you are to make sure that you meet your goals and, you know, you do what you want to do. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not how it translates, because I'm always met with, if you don't do this, then you've fallen short of greatness, pretty much. And so the first time I expressed that, it wasn't met very well. It was kind of like, well, what do you mean? Like, she didn't understand. Like, what? So do you not want to study political science? Do you not want to marry a guy? Do you not want to be a doctor and marry rich? Like, what do you want to do? If that's not the life you want, because I've sacrificed all that I could for you to bring you here, I've walked miles to gather water so that you can drink. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? You know? And it took me some balancing of myself, right? I had to be sure of myself to say, hey, I don't know. And I don't know, but when I figure it out, I'll let you know, you know? Because oftentimes I think when we challenge the status quo, we're expected to have answers, and we don't have answers all the time. And so having that bravery to say, hey, I don't know. Luckily, I had a good mentor that was just like, hey, you're not supposed to know. And it's okay if you don't know. Tell them you don't know, and then go to sleep. Don't lock your door, though, because you can't lock the door. It's not your house, you know? So that's how I was met.
I think for me, the first time as an adult that I recall, and mainly because it was more recent, setting boundaries with my parents is because as I've stated before, I am Muslim. I grew up in a Muslim household. And so, you know, something everyone, you know, knows or claims they know is that, like, you know, Muslim parents are like, well, you marry a Muslim man. And, you know, I fell in love with someone who is not a Muslim man, and sort of came to have that conversation with my parents, like, hey, this is where I'm at. And I thought a lot about why it was that I did that. And it's because the older that I've got, the more I've become clear about what my values are. And I know that one of my top 3 values, if not number 1, okay, is love. And that's love in all forms, whether that's self-love, friendship, romantic love. I love love, and I value it very dearly. And so when I found that that was being challenged, it sort of presented an opportunity for me to step up to the plate and, you know, like sort of like put my, you know, words where my mouth are, or like, you know, essentially to take that challenge on. And initially I was met with a lot of sort of, no, we're not having this, and absolutely not, there's no way this is going to happen. But I think through one, communication is essentially what worked for me, and vulnerability. My parents have now sort of entered a state where acceptance is more of a key. And I don't think that works with everyone, because something I had to learn is that I have to meet my parents where they're at. Like, I'm somewhere and I want them to meet me here, and they're over there. And so for me to bring them over here, I need to understand how they got there, where they are, and how they got there. And they got there through years, 50, 60 plus years of socialization, you know, from their community and their friends and people they trust and love and honor. And so how can I believe that through one conversation with me, they're gonna change their mind immediately? You know, like, girl, you're right, marry that man. Like, no. It takes, I think, a lot of work and a lot of emotional work to get your parents to be on that side, to get your parents to understand your perspective, and numerous conversations, because you can't have one extended 6-hour-long conversation. It's not healthy, and it's who has the time, honestly. But that's what I found, honestly. It's been through repetition, numerous conversation, and vulnerability about where I am in my life, what they want out of me, what I want from myself, and like how I want them to view me. And that all started from a place of honesty. Because what I found, not just through myself, but through a lot of my, like, you know, African and diaspora peers, is we live a double life. You have your life with your friends, and you turning up and you're doing all of this, and then you have your life with your family. And I just got very tired of doing that, of having my American life and my African life, or my Sudanese life, because I'm only one person and I can't split myself in half. And so when I decide to show up and explain to my parents who I am and where I'm coming from, that means presenting them with my full self, even if that's a shock to them because they haven't met me before, you know? And so I think those were hard pills to swallow, but ultimately led in the like safe and healthy creation of those boundaries, which are long evolving, and will continue to happen through time. So that's sort of been my journey with that.
Thank you.
What about you, Gadise? What's it been like for you?
I think very similar to what you said. And I think when you're coming into communicating boundaries with your family, that you have some type of patience, because they're not gonna change overnight. And I realized when I have patience towards, you know, my parents or elders in the family, that I am much more able to recover and not take it as a personal slight towards me. And I say that because, like, the first time you communicate it, they're gonna be like, girl, what? And then the second time, like, you really have to be consistent because they're waiting for you to break, right? Like, you say it once and then you don't reinforce it again, and they're like, all right, that was just a phase. Like, on to the next. You really have to be consistent. And over time, and it's not, I mean, if you have siblings, to me, I think about it as like, this is also for the people that are coming up before me. And then, you know, after a while, I started to see that she was very open, and the way that she communicated was a little bit more open. And so, like, you're also modeling and teaching for your parents too. And when I realized, I think a lot of people realize this as they become adults, like, our parents are also human beings. You know, they have traumas, they've gone through a lot of stuff themselves, they've gone through that socialization, and it's really hard to transition to this. I mean, when I went to college, I'm like, this is a culture shock. Imagine coming to a whole different country, right? And having to learn the language anew, and, like, you know, all of that stuff. Like, it's really, really tough. And so I try to keep that sort of balance for my parents, but also really stand my ground when it comes to my boundaries. But I was gonna ask, because I hear this a lot. So I posted on Twitter today about healthy boundaries and parents for children of immigrants, and a lot of people are like, healthy boundaries? Wait, what? What are you talking about? Like, that can't coexist when it comes to African families. And I wanted to ask you all, especially around, you know, hiding part of you, especially because it's, you know, it might be quote unquote Americanized. Can you be your full self with your family? And is that a prerequisite for a healthy relationship? Or can you pick and choose and it still be a healthy relationship? Do you have to be your whole self with your family?
I already know Nameria's answers.
I'll tell you right now, I come in there turned. I come in there, what's up, what's goody? Listen, no, because I have to be fractions of myself in so many rooms, you know, that I refuse to be a fraction of myself with my family. So I walk in there like, what's up? And they're like, we got to get rid of her. How do we get rid of her? And I don't care. You know what I mean? That's what's up. But I feel like you can't be a fraction of yourself with your family. Your family should be the first place you get to test out the true version of yourself, right? Because if you change your mind, then hey, they said it was just a phase anyway. You know what I mean? So whatever, you know, but my family's given up. They've given up on trying to mold me and have me be this duplicate representative of them. Because as I was telling you guys earlier, I feel like individualism is almost like a threat to the collective, right? Because when you come to America, it's like being a collective is so important because that's how we survive, right? So you have to blend, you have to stay in sync, we all have to have the same story, blah, blah, blah. But early on, like, I started to feel this urge, like, okay, I'm not the same. Like, I do things different and I need to express this. And I felt resistance towards that, whether it was like wearing baggy clothes. Legit, I got pictures of when I was like 4 in like baggy clothes. That's how I was comfortable. That's how I wanted to express myself. And they were not comfortable with that, right? Because they still saw me as a representative of the unit. And so it's still a struggle, right? Because my mom still asked me to go places with her, and she's like, I want you to come to this dance with me, but please dress appropriate. I'm like, what's appropriate? You want me in a 3-piece suit? She's like, absolutely not. I would prefer you come in a dress. And I'm like, all right, well, 1-piece suit it is, because I'm still gonna come as myself, but you know, I'll meet you halfway, like you said, right? Like, meet them where they are, but like, definitely be yourself, because if they can't handle it, down the road, they'll forgive you for it, but you test them out on them anyway.
I don't know, because I've shown up as a larger percentage of myself, and I would even go so far as to say like 95% of myself. But isn't there 5% of themselves everybody kind of keeps to themselves, like, I just don't want nobody to know. You know, like, the parts of myself that I not just care to share, but like am comfortable sharing, and that are large parts of who I am, you know, like those are the parts of me that I want to share. For example, like my relationship is a large part of like where I spend my time and like how I'll move forward. And so that's a part of me that I have to share. I want to. And so then I have to. But, you know, me turning up, like that's not a part of me. That's so great that I feel the need to share it with them. You know, do they probably have an idea? I would assume so. But is that a conversation or like a part of me that has to show up to the conversation? I also don't think so.
Yeah.
What about you, Gadise? Do you think you have to show up as yourself?
Oh, I don't. But I'm still working on it, y'all. I'm only like a year or two in, okay? That's something that I'm working towards, but I also understand, especially for people who are dependent on their parents, right? Their parents are paying they're living under their household, their parents are paying for their cell phone, things like that. I'm lucky enough to be independent where I can support myself and I don't need my family, so that risk is not there to be like kicked out, for example. But I also think about it's about assessing the level of risk, right? And I think there's no one size fits all. It really depends on, can you be safe and healthy in this moment? And sometimes you just need other people that are going to fulfill that wholeness of yourself. I think ideally what Nameria said is that you should be able to be open with your family. And I think if I ever have kids, that's what I want them to feel. Regardless of how I believe somebody should live, I want them to live in the fullness of themselves without feeling like I'm gonna shut them out or kick them out, right? Or neglect them in some way. But I know that, you know, with my parents and with elders in my family, that I gotta pick and choose. And so for me, it's about how do you prioritize being safe first and foremost, and then making sure that you have other places where you can be full. Because sometimes you can't be that with your family, unfortunately. And I don't think that you should have to force that, because I think, you know, lucky enough and I'm speaking for y'all too, like, you don't depend on your family for, like, you can get stuff on your own, right? But for people who may have even toxic family members, right, that it can really jeopardize their safety to say that they're queer, for example. Like, sometimes you don't need to do that in that moment.
So someone said the phrase of picking your battles, and I totally agree, right? Because when I was living with my mom, even though I've been queer for all my life, it wasn't my place at 17 while I was still under her roof to be like, this is who I am, I'm gonna do this and da da da, because I still needed her permission for certain things. You know, so at those times I definitely had to mind my words and kind of, but now that I'm in my own place and I come to visit, you know, so yeah, you definitely have to pick your battles, just because you want to still maintain that level of respect, right? Because that's such a big thing in African families. Like, they see that as, when you start advocating for yourself, you're being disrespectful. You know?
And remember that you can lose the battle but still win the war.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh yes.
Absolutely.
So just to be clear, it's okay to sit back. Okay, the war is ahead.
How many times have I lost the battle because it's a phase? Right? Sure. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Right.
But
that's great. So I think, right, so it's around 5:15. So we want to transition to Dr. Fafowora. If he is here, can pop up. But just to introduce Dr. Fafowora, he is a pastor, but formally trained as a civil, structural, and practice engineer for 20 years before he became a pastor. He holds his doctorate degree in organizational leadership, and he's the president of Leader Skills, Inc., and the Open Pulpit. and he pastors with his wife at RCCG Jesus Embassy, Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's really great to have a parent give some sort of insight on what it looks like to create boundaries. And so I know you have 5 daughters. They're in their 20s and 30s. But can you talk a little bit about your family dynamic and what it looks like to create boundaries and healthy relationships with your daughters?
I'm so blessed to be part of this wonderful team. I've joined you from the very beginning, so I heard everything everybody had to say. And some of you make us parents look as if we are of this different world. We are not. We are not. How many minutes do I have so I can know how to
About 15 minutes. Yeah, and then we're gonna go into
15 minutes. Can I just have 6 minutes?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Good, thank you. There are certain things I want us to understand when it comes to reparenting the children we brought from Africa.
Can we ask Pastor about the noise in the background? It's kind of difficult to hear.
Well, thank you.
Hold on, please. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Is it better? Thank you. So there are few subheadings I want to mention briefly before we go to the questions. Number 1, communication. African fathers issue instructions. But here in the US, fathers now operate discussions. There's a big difference between instructions and discussions. Number 2, African fathers don't participate in their children's activities in Africa. Why? Driver has to take them to school. When they come back home, there are helps at home. We engage teachers to help them with their assignment, with their homework. But here in the US, an African father has no choice rather than to be part and parcel of the activities of his children, particularly when they are in high school. He has to be part of their assignments, part of their projects, part of their games and sports, and also part of their education. He has to assist them with their assignments, and they're very tough here. The third point is education. African fathers believe the authentic careers are medicine, engineering, law, accounting. If you don't do any of those things, we don't believe you're a serious student. You don't believe, every other degree is considered inferior, including business administration. So now I happen to be a successful engineer. My wife happened to be a medical doctor. And my wife's father, my father-in-law, was a medical doctor. My own father was an architect. So we come with that line of professional career. So we expected naturally that all these, I call them rats, like you all. My apology. That's the way I joke with my children. We expect that at least we have 4 doctors or 2 doctors or 3 engineers and that kind of thing. But when they began to receive counseling, it was a different thing entirely. And then it was a bitter pill for some of us to swallow. Fourth one, food. We came here, expert consumers of African Nigerian food that we call swallow, the fufu, the okra, and all those things. So naturally, we parents, when we have to prepare food for the children before they come back to school, we prepare African food. We did not realize that their taste buds changed soon after they got to America. So they prefer McDonald's, they prefer pizza. So when I go to cook, I cook beans that takes me hours. And my beans waste away, it gets me angry. But my wife prepares some decent stew or porridge. I don't eat it. We tell they were wasting food. So that in itself caused some disturbance in the communication among us. Now, for me, the greatest tool that helped me in particular is a higher level of education. When I did my doctorate degree in organizational leadership, I learned something called emotional intelligence. And I actually teach that course to MBA students. So with emotional intelligence that I teach, it was easy for me to change and acclimatize. My wife too had her own PhD in epidemiology here in the US. And along the line, because of the higher education she had, it was easy for her also to begin to change. So we knew more about personal competence and social competence. We knew the difference. We knew about self-awareness, knew about self-management. We knew about social awareness and relationship management. Let me mention another one, marriages. Marriages. I never for one didn't want any of my children to marry in Nigeria. Impossible. Because we Nigerians, our drama is too much when it comes to in-laws, etc. And then competition between this family and that family, so I didn't care. And that was easy for me because my senior brother married a French lady. And my niece and my niece and my nephew, they still live in France. So 4 years ago, I went to conduct the wedding for my niece in France. Then one of my brother-in-laws, who is a doctor, also already married a Caucasian. They live in Britain. So we were used to this cross-cultural kind of marriage. And one thing, being a pastor, I pride myself as father of nations.
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet.
Shut up.
Check out the help section in your Ultimate Ears app.
That's okay. Sorry, as I was saying, you used to whine like that. I said, shut up. I'm talking to what we call these technical people that talk to you where you don't talk to them. As I was saying. So when it comes to marriage, my wife and I were disappointed. We don't care where it comes from. The only sentiment we share is that you have to be a believer. It helps if the person fears God, So now in Africa, we expect young ladies to live in the family until they get married. But here in the US, all our daughters, when they graduate and they get a good job, they want to rent their own apartment. To me, it didn't make sense because here we are. We live in Orange County in California. One of my daughters, who happened to read engineering, has a nice job in Long Beach. Long Beach is just 10 minutes drive away from us. She insisted she has to have an own apartment. She wanted to be independent. So left her. Another one got a good job in Los Angeles. Said, Dad, I need to experiment how to live alone. She went to live in LA. The youngest one that finished in Harvard came back from Boston. She got a job in LA. Said, Dad, I too am moving to LA. Okay, guys, what's going on here? We pay mortgage or rent of almost $4,000. You go to different places to pay $1,800 all over the place. Why don't we pool our resources together? Let's go and live in the best place. They say, Dad, that's your generation. Okay, that's it. We accepted that, and that's it. Now, the other thing I want to mention briefly is the dress etiquette. Dress etiquette. We are concerned about indecent exposures, particularly during summer, where the girls that we saw the place, we are next to nothing. We do not believe that our daughters should be like that. Not because we are pastors, but because we are Africans. Because when a girl dresses so indecently, she runs the risk of packaging or presenting herself wrongly. So to say, we believe in Africa, it may be erroneous, I'm not defending it, that once a girl dresses loosely, it means she's loose. That's the African belief, And then we are not, when it now comes to other life, we believe that dressing well to church is a must. Because it's an African belief that if you have God, the Almighty God, and you go to see him, you've got to put up your best appearance. If you're going to see President Trump, if you're going to see the governor of California State, you can't just go anyhow. If you are going for any interview for a great job, you can't just go anywhere, anyhow. So therefore, if you're going to go to church, that's God Almighty, then you have to do that. Make sure that you present yourself there. Now, the next thing I want to manage is the cultural shock for us parents also, because many of the children do not believe that the way they were suffering the culture, we too are suffering the cultural shock. The bills you have to pay automatically when they come. There is no delay. In Africa, if you delay a bill for some time, you can see one way or another. You can still talk, you can still call somebody, you can still do so many things. In America, there's no help from nowhere. In Africa, I can call my cousin, I can call my brother, I can say, oh, I need this, and my children's fees is due, but that kind of thing does not exist. So that makes us African parents to live on edge, to work very hard, and to make sure also that we do not deny our children what their colleagues are enjoying wherever they are. Now, for me, before I came to America, I did not have to drive a car for 16 years because I had drivers. I had a driver for myself. My wife had a driver. I had a driver for the children. I had to drive them to school. So you can imagine my pain when I got here and I have to leave 90% of my daytime carrying one child from one sport to another game to other assignments, and they all have different preferences. So before we ever get home, sometimes I'm fagged out, I'm tired, I'm impatient. But we were able to handle that a little bit, God helping us. Now, another thing that we want to do, what I want to say is that we parents, unlike you guys who probably were born here, who study here, whose accent changed quickly, our accent can't change any longer. They turn to us stiff. So we're at the place of work and everything, you are battling with, what did you say? Say that again. Which sometimes will affect your self-image if you're not careful. When I started lecturing in the university after my doctorate degree, I used to feel shy, not to talk at the meetings because of my accent. Until one day, an Indian spoke. His accent was worse than my accent. I had to back up with what he was saying, with shaking his head, body language and everything. I got confident. There wasn't anything wrong with my grammar. My grammar is even Queen's grammar. So I began to speak at meetings. And eventually, I became one of the counselors in the college. I became one of the advisors in the college. And I met a few people who have been there before, who just started the education at the master's level. I challenged them. They're not used to start. If you do masters in Africa, you're not used to stopping at masters. You go on and do a doctorate degree. So I was able to persuade one or two of them to go, and they went, and they were happy for it. One other thing I just want to say there, then I keep short, then you can fire your questions. Now, discipline. That's an area that one had to reorientate, change its orientation. In Africa, we believe in physical corporate punishment. And the Bible also supports this. The Bible says, spare the rod and spoil the child. But we realize here that a thin line separates physical discipline and physical abuse. In Africa, if you tell a young girl or a young boy something twice, the third time is a dirty slap. You don't repeat yourself. That's what happens. But here, it's an abuse. Because that physical abuse does not necessarily change the mind of that person. It makes that person become rebellious on the inside. And is waiting until he gets his own independence. So I think I can stop there now, right? So, questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Real quick, I really appreciate you sharing your story. And I think, from a child perspective, we rarely get our parents' perspective on what it feels like to migrate to the US and just the little things that you all have to deal with. For example, like when we don't want to eat, you know, I love Ethiopian food, so I never resisted that. But, you know, for kids that maybe resist things that are natural to you, as a parent, like what that feels like to meet that resistance from your kids that are growing up in a different place. And I really appreciate you humanizing just the parent position and what that looks like. And even the things around like collectivism too, and how in the United States, like the parent takes sole responsibility of the child. Like my mom would take us to soccer practice, school, like anything else that we needed to go to, she was doing that on top of going to school and also going to work. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. I don't know, Wad and Nameria, if anything that he said sort of sparked something for you.
Well, I was thinking as he said, talking about collectivism, right? We come here, and at the same time, as well, I can only speak for myself, right? Like when I came, I was trying so hard to assimilate that I almost didn't think about how my parents were assimilating, right? Because my first priority was to fit in, because I'm involved in these spaces where I have to fit in constantly and getting that feedback. And so I guess this is the first time I thought about what the other side felt like, right? Because I'm moving far ahead, right? Now I'm eating Lunchables and and things like that on the home front. And I come home and you want me to have stew, and I'm like, that's not what I want right now, you know. Where's the Lunchables, you know? And so I can recognize and acknowledge how difficult that is to keep that pace of a forward movement between the two of us. So.
Nameria, something you said that really, and something Dr. Fafowora that you said that, you know, I've just been sort of thinking about is I didn't realize how isolated my parents actually are. Mm-hmm. You know, similar to whether it's the food
I'm at a meeting now. I'm not speaking.
My experience. Just thinking about my experience, the way that I think about it is that, you know, I am the individual who was brought to this country. And so I'm the one who doesn't fit in Sudan or fit in America. And so I'm in this weird balancing act. But something I never take the time to think about is my parents are too, you know, because as they assimilate, they are, you know, as they assimilate and as they grow and as they take in the information that I'm giving them about my experiences, their ideas about things are changing. And those ideas may not be reflected in the Sudanese culture that they know whenever they go back to Sudan. And those ideas are neither fully reflected in the American culture that they currently live in. And so the limbo that I'm living in, they're also currently living in and trying to raise us in that process. Right. And so that was a huge humanization, you know, of just like parents and raising children, you know, away from your home and your family and everything that you know, honestly. And then the second thing, Dr. Fafowora, that you said that really touched me was about in a lot of African countries, Sudan in particular, it is instruction. And here there is more of an emphasis on discussion. Woo! Okay, listen. That is something that we have worked very hard to maintain in this household. Like, we're discussing what does and we started with something very small. What does everyone want to eat tonight? We're taking a vote, you know, and just starting with something that small, I felt like laid the groundwork for larger decisions to come in my family. And so thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure everyone has loads of questions. I know I do.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to add one or two things. The parents that some parents have.
Uh-oh. Is he frozen on everyone else's end?
Some of us came here because our finances were limited. So therefore, to us, it becomes more expensive if people have to eat different things and that kind of thing. And we are financially conscious. But no further we discuss those things with his children to say, oh, the friends are beginning and let's all eat something. No parent wants no parent wants children to think that he or she is poor. That's the, and then finally we suffered a lot of discrimination. For example, I went to register my daughters in a fee-paying school, and I was paying $400 per child. There are 5 of them. I didn't mind. We, my wife and I, we sold everything we had in Africa to make sure that we give them a good education. Imagine a counselor in the school that was racist, telling my daughters that one of them said she wanted to become an engineer. And the advisor or the counselor, some 70-something-year-old woman said, no, you can become an engineer. Maybe you want to become a plumber or an electrician. My daughter said, no, my father is an engineer, my grandfather is an architect, my mother is a medical doctor, my grandmother. The woman said, that is in Africa. So we have to go there to go and more or less put them in that place where they belong. Invariably, we now discover that even the children we are being discriminated. Sorry to interrupt your questions. I'm all for you.
Okay, sorry, I think you broke up a little bit.
Yeah. Hello.
But I wanted to say, I think I caught what you said in that first part about, we, as parents, you have financial responsibilities that you're thinking about. And when Wad said, like, we're going to come to a vote, that can be expensive, right? Trying to accommodate, especially if you have more than 1, 2, 3 kids. And I come from a big family too. So that's something else that they're also thinking about in the back of their mind. Like, can I actually afford doing that and accommodating everything?
Yeah.
And making cost-efficient decisions. But the problem, I think, for us is that we're not privy to those things, right? And so, like, we just think that they just don't want us to do these things, right? They don't want us to go to soccer camp, for example. And to me, it's like, where does it come in where parents can be open and honest about why and how they're making their decisions? And I feel like that would help children, or even as adults, or have an understanding about where they're coming from. And then the second thing, I know, Nameria, you want to say something, but I wanted to also say how, because my mom, right, she grew up in Ethiopia. And like I said before, I grew up in a predominantly white space. And so, like, I was dealing with things when it came to racism that my mom never had to deal with. And so, like, having to communicate that to her and not have her understand fully what that meant, to be called the N-word when you're walking down the street, right? And my mom has a very tough skin, so that didn't even bother her. She's like, I'm African, I don't care. But, like, there's a disconnect too on, how I received racism and discrimination at school and how my parents were able to help me. And I feel like it would have looked different if I had parents who also grew up in the United States and could relate in that way. Nameria, you were about to say something.
Well, I was gonna say that in trying to get everyone's vote and trying to make everyone happy when there is a large family, the matter of the fact is pizza is gonna cost $20 and rice is $2. It's a matter of survival, right? So I think although I preach individualism and advocating for self, we also have to recognize where those things come up and our parents are just moving on survival, where we have come to learn this level of comfort, right? Like, we are able to afford these things and these luxuries, and if you don't like a job, quit it, get another one that pays better because you got better education and things like that. They're not always previewed and privileged to those things,
Absolutely. About 5 minutes. So I wanted to also give people the chance to ask questions. So if you have questions for us or Dr. Fafowora, please add them in the chat. Wad, did you want to say something?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, what I was just gonna say as a last point is that there is a happy medium between, like, giving all the choices in the world as a vote and allowing people to feel like they have a say in what happens like to the family or to the unit, you know? So like if we can only afford rice, then we can also only afford beans. And we can also only afford like corn. And so if you give me those three choices and I have an opportunity to discuss with you why I want one versus the other, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be you have the one all end all choices and it's pizza and crabs and lobster. But if you allow it, like it takes a sense of vulnerability from the side of the parents as well. You know, like, and I think a lot of children are kind of privy to what financial restraints a family is or is not going through. You know, and so if that's communicated and sort of like, these are the options that we have, like, what is everyone interested in? And this is obviously, we're just using the food voting example. It sort of just lays a groundwork that everyone in this family has a voice and everyone in this family like deserves to be like loved and taken care of. And like your opinions matter here as well. And that's not always the case, nor has that always been the case in this household. But a question that Iman asked earlier that I think would be very relevant, and especially for you as well, Dr. Fafowora, if you want to talk about what did your daughters creating boundaries with you and your wife look like? And then for us, what did the process of discovering our own boundaries look like, even before communicating them?
Thank you very much.
So
we didn't have the luxury of even talking about boundaries because we were all learning, and the learning was chaotic. And because we raised girls, it was easy for me because my girls, they are very obedient. They're not rebellious. They're not, they don't pull much trouble. If they pull anyone, they pull it on the instant, which I didn't like. So and apart from that, where we were living was so small at the very beginning. So it was like a communal living. So how much boundary can you bring forth? It is when you have a lot of luxury that you can be talking about. But there was no partition. There was nothing. We went out shopping together all the time, and people used to envy me. They say, "Why do you have all these girls? Oh, my daughters are very beautiful, just like their mom." Well, I probably say, "Oh yes, I'm the one." But the only thing that had to change, anytime we went shopping, because they're all girls, I buy the same dress for all of them, different sizes. Even when they grew up, I didn't realize they were growing up. I just thought that they were not wearing what I bought for them. I mean, it was like school uniform to them. That. Lastly, do not live under a false pretense that you are talking about has to do with cultural change. No, there's also generational change. If my parents and us, if we didn't come to America, we still be looking at them as to be looking at us as my God, this generation is hopeless. So whether we come to America or not, so all of you, your generation is what you understand now. By the time you begin to raise your children, they are going to be exposed to something slightly different. And they're going to be looking at you differently, the way you are looking at us. It's something that will go on forever and never and never. It is then the clarity will come to some of you that, oh, okay, so this is what we were talking about that time. My prayer for you is that you will never have difficult children. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I'm done.
What was the question that Iman asked? Was it how do we come to know our boundaries, right?
Yeah, she asked us how, sorry, let me open up the chat. It was a question about what was the process of discovering your boundaries? What did that look like even before communicating them? What did it look like to even realize that you needed boundaries?
Well, I think I said this earlier, but for me, it was entering into spaces where I wasn't comfortable. And this was like among family, right? And so I started to recognize like, okay, something has to change. I have to say something because I want to be here, because I enjoy my culture. I enjoy my family. I could do a little jig with the African slide, you know, but I want to wear pants. And how do I advocate for myself and make everyone uncomfortable, but at the same time still participate in my culture, you know? I think so. Once I started to maybe get a better sense of self, right? Like, okay, this is where I'm comfortable, and this may not be where they're comfortable, but I still have to participate. And so I have to find this medium with them, is when I started to speak up for myself. Like, okay, I need to do this for me. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not going to show up at this event because I don't like the way this pastor preaches. And so I'm sorry, Mom, like, I will show up to church. It may not be your church, but I'll be at church on Sunday morning. And, you know, so that was like a big deal, right? Because she was like, what you mean?
The problem with most parents is that they don't ever believe that you are old enough to look after yourself. Mm-hmm. That is the big issue. But the moment they are persuaded that, well, you're of age, you can take care of yourself, all pressures cease. Trust me.
I think I was going to say for myself, like when I realized that I needed boundaries that I needed to communicate, was when I couldn't function in other areas of my life. Like I couldn't pay attention to school in the same way because family was weighing so heavily. So I had like literally no choice. It's so sad that it had to come to a point where I had no choice but to communicate these things, because I think you should be able to communicate boundaries, even if it's a small nuisance, you know, like you can still function in your day. But I think when I realized it was when I really couldn't pay attention with school. Like it was just consuming my mind so much. And so I was sort of forced in order to function in daily life to communicate those things. And so I think that might be the hardest part for children, is like realizing what makes you feel good, and then how do you advocate and communicate that to your parents, given you know the certain circumstances that they may be living in. Because I think in a lot of ways, it's like you create stories on how they're going to react. So sometimes you're like, oh, they're going to disown me. Or like, I remember when I changed my major, I came in as a chemical engineering major and I switched to sociology and Black studies. And so I created this whole scenario of my mom, like, you know, getting really angry, or I don't know, just being really disappointed in me, and I really wanted her affirmation. And so when I finally told her, I think a couple years after I declared my major, she was like, it's whatever makes you happy. And I'm like, wait, what? So this whole time I was creating this narrative of how she was going to react, and it was totally different. So I think like the part of awareness, and sometimes it comes when you really have no other choice and you have to communicate those boundaries. And unfortunately, it's like when there's no, you know, you can't function in life. But I think after that, it gets easier after you see how they react. Like when my mom reacted in that way, it like affirmed to me that she can take feedback and like take things that I feel like she might not agree with. And so I wanted to end, it's 5:49, but I wanted to end with just like a nugget of advice from each of you all. So how would you advise others to start having those conversations with their parents? And I'm assuming most people here are not parents,
so for me, like when I really think about like, is it necessary to have this conversation? Because I don't like conflict. So I much rather let everyone do their own thing, and if I can get away with it, then everybody's cool. But when it becomes necessary to have conversation about these things, whether it's for your health or for your relationship, I say you have to think about if these cultural boundaries or these boundaries formed by your family are effective for your life. Like, are they doing anything that makes you feel safe, that makes you feel loved, that makes you feel like yourself? And if you feel like you are in question or at conflict with that, then it's probably best that you have the audacity to speak up for yourself, right? And like I said earlier, they're your family. Like, they're not gonna disown you. They might not talk to you for a little bit, but you'll be just fine. Like, they have nowhere to throw you, like they tell me all the time. Like, you know, so once you feel like you are becoming a friction to yourself and a stranger to yourself, and you have to speak up for yourself, I dare you to question those boundaries, because chances are your parents and your elders are okay. They're gonna be okay. They're gonna move at the progression that you're willing to go to accept you, because they prefer you over tradition and culture. So
Advice.
sure.
I listened to you very well, and
Okay.
you made a very, very useful contribution. I want to advise all of you guys, make sure that you initiate conversations, discussions with your parents about anything that you do not like. When you initiate discussions and conversations, they are convinced that you are growing older. Then use your parents to practice how to discuss, resolve conflicts in a win-win situation, because when you get married, you'll be thrown into different scenario completely. Marriage with your husband, married with your husband's family, married with your own children. So it's good for you to begin to initiate discussions and conversations about things that will not make you comfortable, so that the boundaries are clearly defined. Thank you.
That's great.
My nugget of advice would be that to come to the table with vulnerability. A lot of times I think that we expect our parents to be the bigger person and, you know, like, well, you should come to me and like, tell me if there's hardship and like initiate that conversation with me. So very similar to what Dr. Fafowora was saying, being that person to start that conversation from a place of vulnerability and transparency really, I think, opens the floodgates. One, because especially in Sudanese culture, secrecy is something that is very much normalized, especially within, like, you know, keeping secrets within your own family and then within your extended family. And it's always about shame and like maintaining the image. What will people say, you know? And so that, unfortunately, for a lot of, you know, like in terms of my community, has created a culture and an air where people feel uncomfortable disclosing the closest parts of themselves and the most vulnerable parts of themselves for fear of what others will think, even if those others are their own family members, right? Or their own parents. And what I found through that vulnerability is very similar to what Nameria said, is that at the end of the day, your parents love you. And they care for you, and they spend time putting work into you. And so the least that you can do is to show up as yourself for them. And that means to come as your full self. So I know it's hard and I know it's difficult, but I would say lead with vulnerability.
And also throw in a compliment to them before you start your disgraceful journey, you know? So
but one other thing is that we parents are also scared of not being a failure over the children. We are very scared of that. So because of that, we sometimes overreact. But when you begin to initiate discussions with us, and we discuss it and there, everything, then you're fine. It's a process. Thank you, guys.
I think what I would say to close this out is to start with yourself. You know, this journey has taken a lot of self-discovery, and I think in a lot of ways we've had to unlearn things that we've grown up with, and that takes time, right? You have to know that you deserve to have these boundaries. You just deserve to put yourself first, and that takes time and affirmation to do that. Sometimes that takes therapy. Sometimes that takes a trusted friend to tell you that. I really encourage therapy. But yeah, I just want just to start that journey of like knowing that you deserve, because you really deserve that space to be affirmed and be loved in the way that you want to, and to trust your gut. You know when things are not right. You know when things do not sit well. I think I've dealt with a lot of like just questioning what I want, and been in the sort of cycle of like putting other people first. And so I've had to realize that I need to put myself first, and this is what I want, and that you can still be in community as you advocate for yourself too. So a practice that I like to do, kind of going off of what Nameria said in terms of complimenting, but like reassuring your parents, like, I love you, and this is not anything about you, right? This is about me and what I want. And I realized once I started communicating with that to them, and I continue to act in the same way after. It's about the recovery, right? Like after you communicated those things, they sort of notice that your relationship doesn't change, it actually gets better. So once you do it once, you really won't stop, you know what I mean? And it'll open up that conversation for your parents to also communicate what they need for you too. So I think we'll conclude with that. We kind of stayed a little bit over, but thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. Oh.
This has been a very wonderful conversation. How do we get this to parents out there who still need to have this kind of, to help them better?
Well, Dr. Fafowora, if you can just gather them for us, we'll meet you right back here next week, same time. We could do that for you. If you could just collect them for us.
Yeah, there are some years I can do better still. I have what I call the open pulpit. I can bring your representatives to come and discuss on the open pulpit.
Okay.
It will be part 1, part 2, part 3. It can be different topics, and then because that without really making a change, we're just wasting our time.
We would be more than welcome to humbly come and discuss and be open to discussing these topics, because the issue is understanding, right? We all have to understand and walk away with a sense of understanding, because we all want the same thing. We just have to understand each other better.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Well, this course is so helpful to both sides. I didn't know if you guys recorded this. If it's recorded, I don't mind posting it on the open pulpit for the whole community to learn from, if it is recorded. Amen.
Yes, sir.
It is. Yes,
Good.
It is recorded. Yeah.
If I have the copy, I'm going to put it on the open pulpit. I'm going to put it in all my social platforms so that people can learn.
I love
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fafowora.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. We put our social in the chat, so if you want to connect with us afterwards, please feel free to do that. Also, thank you to Amplify Africa for hosting us.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Definitely. All right, y'all. Thanks for joining the discussion.
We hope to see y'all next time.